In 1983, Nintendo would release their first cartridge-based home video game console in Japan. This would be the family computer, better known as the Famicom. 2 years later, it would also see release outside of Japan, repackaged and rebranded as the Nintendo Entertainment System. But around this time, there was also release of a new, Japanese exclusive add-on for the Famicom. This would be a potentially revolutionary advance in console gaming that was pulled straight out of the computer hardware playbook. It would result in games that were significantly cheaper, could be rewritten with new games via special machines, and even had stuff such as, well, load times for one, but also an additional sound channel compared to their cartridge counterparts. This would be the Famicom Disk System, an add-on for the Famicom that allowed for games to be played off of small floppy disks. But come 1986, and another addition to the Famicom family would come out in Japan. This would combine both a standard Famicom and a disk system into one unit. And though it would receive Nintendo's blessing, it wouldn't be created or sold by them. Instead, it would be designed and sold by electronics company Sharp. This dual format Nintendo system would be named the Sharp Twin Famicom. But how did this thing come to be? Why does it exist? And why is it perhaps the best NES out there for those into retro game collecting and playing games off of officially licensed hardware? Well, there's only one way to find out. This is Stuff We Play, home of everything weird and retro. Today's look, the Sharp Twin Famicom, the best NES ever made. But before we go on, I need to give a massive thank you to Robert and Abby Hornibrook, great friends of mine and patrons as well, who sent me this Twin Famicom unit that's being featured in today's video. It even has a little cardboard protector that is supposed to go inside the floppy drive when not using it. I can't thank them enough. And really and truly, this video would not have been possible without them. I hope that this video will serve as both a good resource on the Twin Famicom and be entertaining as well. So with that, let's dive right into it. Nintendo and the Sharp Corporation have a long history of working together, going back to the days before Nintendo was best known for video games. Thus, we turn to the 1970s, an era in which Nintendo was best known for ventures such as toy making and, love hotels. In 1970, inventor Gunpei Yokoi, who would later design the Game Boy, collaborated with Sharp engineer Masayuki Yomura on a light gun-based arcade game called Nintendo Beam Gun Game. This would be followed with a solar-powered gun toy, also worked on jointly by Nintendo and Sharp. This would be called the Nintendo Beam Gun. From here, a special relationship would form between the two companies, with this ultimately leading to, in the 1980s, Nintendo granting Sharp near exclusive permission to manufacture their own officially sanctioned variants of the family computer video game console. The Famicom itself would see release in 1983, that being somewhat redesigned and released in North America as the NES in 1985. However, also crucial to this story is the Famicom Disk System, a floppy disk drive add-on for the Famicom that was released in early 1986. Years before rival console manufacturer Sega gained infamy for releasing add-ons for their Sega Genesis console in the form of the Sega CD32X, Nintendo released this thing. The discs here are slightly smaller than your average 3.5-inch floppy disk, and as a form of copy protection, all official discs have the word Nintendo engraved into the bottom. The idea was that discs without this engraving wouldn't be able to fit inside an FDS unit, but bootleggers soon got around this by simply realizing that they could just cut out a slot in their discs in the space where the engraving should be, and they'd fit and read just fine. FDS games also had some advantages over their cartridge-based counterparts. As the disk system launched before save batteries became the norm in cartridge-based games, being able to read and write to a disk meant that saving one's progress and a title was possible. This could be seen in games such as the Japanese version of the original Metroid, which was a disk system release. In addition, games were cheaper than those on cartridge. The FDS itself cost 15,000 yen, the equivalent of around $100 USD at launch, which many saw as a steep price of entry. But FDS games themselves averaged only around 2,600 yen, or around $17 USD at the time. Along with being able to save, the FDS added an additional sound channel to games, leading to many FDS games having richer sounding soundtracks than their cartridge-based NES counterparts. Let's take the opening to the original Legend of Zelda here, for example. And speaking of Zelda, that game launched the same day as the FDS in Japan, and soon became a killer app for the platform. It was actually only exclusively available on a disc format there, until getting a re-release on cartridge nearly 8 years later in 1994, as one of the final Famicom releases. And with that said, the FDS itself wasn't without its quirks. Games being on floppy disk meant that they could be rewritten, and Nintendo took advantage of that. In shops around Japan, Nintendo had disc writer kiosks installed, where players could take either blank discs or existing game discs, and for only 500 yen, or around $3.25 USD at the time, players could write an entirely new game to their disc. This service proved to be quite popular, and Nintendo would even keep open a mail-order version of it until they discontinued servicing FDS units in 2003. And that's right, 2003. The last FDS game was released in 1992, with new releases mainly stopping due to, by that point, games such as Dragon Quest IV were being released on cartridge, which along with having a built-in save battery, was also 8 times larger than was possible for an FDS game to be released on, if it was on a single disc of course. Retro PC gamers likely all know the pain of having to deal with disc swapping, and so Japanese game publishers in the late 80s and very early 90s shifting back to making cartridge-based games for the Famicom seems like a logical choice. Also, I should mention that due to the whole disc writer kiosk popularity thing, yeah, a lot of times if you find a Famicom Disk System game nowadays, the game on the disc won't be what's actually labeled on there. So you could very well buy something thinking you're getting The Legend of Zelda, when in reality you're getting Othello. Combine this with FDS games having load times, and floppy disks being a finicky format that can be fairly easily corrupted, and it's easy to see why, only 6 years after launch, the FDS already seemed like obsolete tech. Also, I guess it kind of helped that the Super Famicom was already out by that point. Side note, apparently an American version of the FDS was planned at one point, and Nintendo of America even announced it in late 1986. That's why the NES in the US had that expansion port in the bottom, which was never used. I'm sure there's a host of reasons as to why this never happened, and perhaps I'll dive into it in a proper documentary at some point. Now let's go back a few years from 1992 to mid-1986. Though the FDS was somewhat popular in Japan, selling over 4 million units, it did have a few hardware design quirks. In order to use it with a Famicom, you had to also have this RAM adapter that attaches to the top of the Famicom itself. The system would then typically sit on top of the disk drive, which itself was a bit bigger than the actual Famicom. Also, did I mention that the FDS needs to use its own power supply? Yeah, like the Sega CD or the TurboGrafx CD, the FDS needs its own power source. Though Nintendo did seem to realize that power supply space would be at a premium in many households. So, they also gave the option to power the FDS with 6 C-cell batteries. Also, unless you were lucky enough to own the later AV Famicom, you were stuck playing FDS games using the Famicom's base RF out. Enter Sharp. Sharp probably realized that having one system that can play both cartridge and disc-based games was probably better than having 2 systems that had to be hooked together to do so. Thus, only a few months after the FDS itself was released, on the 1st of July 1986, the Sharp Twin Famicom was released to the world. Along with combining both an FDS and a standard Famicom together, the Twin Famicom had some nice quality of life changes. Instead of relying on RF out, this was the first iteration of the Famicom to come standard with an analog AV connection, though only with mono sound. Plus, thankfully, it only required one power supply. It contains the same Ricoh-made CPU and GPU as the NES, and operates almost exactly like a standard Famicom Disk System combo. Also, no weird connections or RAM cartridges either. It's a fully contained standalone console, and typically coming in variations of red on black or black on red, it looks positively 80s in the best possible ways. Clearly, people at the time liked this look as well, as it sold well enough to get a second revision in 1987, which featured a black body with blue trim and controllers with turbo buttons. Of unique note here is the name. While the actual Famicom was formerly named the Family Computer, the Twin Famicom was actually just named the Twin Famicom. Due to copyright weirdness involving the word Famicom, Nintendo themselves were unable to ever actually refer to it as the Famicom. In every bit of marketing that Nintendo released, they had to strictly refer to it as the Family Computer. But somehow, this didn't apply to Sharp, and it also didn't apply later on when Nintendo released their successor to the Family Computer, the Super Famicom. While I'm sure you would love for me to dive in depth and explain the intricacies and loopholes within 1980s Japanese copyright law, I think instead I'd like to dive into something just as fascinating: the different types of features, ports, and connectors present on this old video game console. The standard Famicom cartridge slot is on top of the console, and a disk drive is on the front. There's a hefty eject button in front of the cartridge slot that does quite a good job at ejecting cartridges, and there's also a toggle switch here that flips in two directions, toggling between booting up in cartridge or FDS mode. This switch also doubles as a lock for the cartridge slot. If you have the system in disk mode, you can't insert a cartridge, but if you have it in cartridge mode, the switch will refuse to let you boot into disk mode. On the front next to disk drive, we have a disk eject button, a reset button, and a big red power button. Moving around to the back of the unit, we have the DC power in, the AV connectors, and a spot to connect an RF modulator if you so wish to. We also see where the wires of the hardwire controllers go into the unit. Like on the original Famicom, the controllers here are hardwired to the system itself, and really aren't given much room to work with. I think the intent is that you'd have long AV and power cables, and then you just play the system itself with it sitting in front of you on a coffee table or something. With that said, I actually really like the feel of these hardwire controllers, and I actually prefer how they feel over the regular NES controllers. I mean, the buttons feel mostly the same, and some may think that having the power cable coming out of the side instead of the top is weird, but I do like them. They have curved edges instead of the NES pad's jagged lines, and thus provide the same level of precision as the NES controller, while actually being a decent bit more comfortable for long periods of use. And yes, the second player controller has a microphone built into it, perfect for games such as The Legend of Zelda, where in Japan there were certain types of enemies that you had to yell at to kill. The only other major connectors here are on the right side of the console. There's this clear cover here that's concealing an accessory port for use of peripherals such as a light gun. As we can see as well, the cover itself is made of some sort of brittle glass plastic material that somewhat fell apart in my hand the first time I held it. That's actually why it's being held together by tape right now. I'll likely 3D print a new cover at some point, as I don't typically play light gun games and want to keep as much dust out of this unit as possible. There's also this mysterious black sliding door that unveils perhaps the oddest port on this unit. According to my research, this connector is for actually connecting a standard Famicom to the Twin Famicom to basically just use this as a Famicom Disk System unit. Why anyone would ever do this is beyond me, but I guess it's cool that the option is there. Also, before anyone asks, you can use a regular FDS unit with the Twin Famicom. It'll work no problem. Well, I mean, it'll boot up no problem anyways. Yeah, I can't actually fully test my standard FDS system, as it suffered the same fate that plagues most FDS and Twin Famicom units nowadays: belt failure. Like with most floppy drives, the Famicom Disk System relies on a rubber belt to actually spin the drive, and the one in my FDS has unfortunately failed. As for my Twin Famicom though, when Robert sent it to me, he told me that the disk drive here was being rather finicky, though I've had few if any issues at all with it so far. Regardless, I'm planning on eventually replacing the belts on both of these, and my FDS unit is a very prime candidate for being the focus of a restoration video. Actually, there is one other area of note on the Twin Famicom's build quality. Nintendo was always known for making high quality systems, but somehow Sharp's offering here feels even sturdier and better built than even the NES. It's a really hefty piece of kit, and it honestly feels like I could hit my unit with a blunt weapon and it'd be completely fine. I mean, I won't, but I'm sure I could. So, could I recommend buying a Twin Famicom in 2020? I mean, this isn't a buying guide and is more of an overview, but I feel like this is a question that at least someone watching this is probably asking themselves. But honestly, I probably couldn't recommend buying this unless you're really into import game collecting. It's a really great console, but unless you have easy access to Japanese stores such as Book Off, you're looking at paying exorbitant eBay prices for this thing. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely love this system. I mean, the games here don't look as pretty as they would upscale on a modern TV through a console such as the Analog NT, or, on a modern PC through emulation, but I'm kind of assuming that if you're playing on a Twin Famicom, you're aiming more for retro appeal than modern comfort. But really and truly, as much as I love this thing, I couldn't recommend that you watching this right now pay potentially a couple $100s for a system that's over 30 years old. So with that, I again need to give a huge thank you to Robert and Abby Hornibrook for making this video possible. And just for being awesome. They didn't just send me the Twin Famicom, but they sent me a Sega Nomad and a PC Engine Super CD-ROM 2 unit. But with that, I also need to give thanks to some of my other patrons as well. Now, of course, it's Dylan Ola, Justin Chipman, and the Golden Bolt. They're awesome. Seriously, all I ask is that if you enjoyed this video, that you like it, and let me know down in the comment section below what hardware do you want to see me dive in depth, do restorations on, or do buying guides on in the future. Let me know, and while you're at it, why don't you subscribe to Stuff We Play for more great content like this. So with that, thank you very much for watching, stay classy, and I'll see you next time.